Hey, I hope everyone is comfortable and we're going to kick off today. Thank you. Thank you for joining us this evening and for Elizabeth this morning. I know it's early for you, but welcome everyone to Uncommon's virtual fireside chat on how to set boundaries and stick to them. I'm Saranta, Head of Learning at Uncommon, a professional network for women in leadership. I'm really grateful to be discussing this really important subject with all of you today. A little bit about me. In my previous chapter before Uncommon, I was building my own business, a co-working space in Singapore, where I really fell in love with supporting communities, entrepreneurs, and people. A couple of years ago, I started my own consultancy to support leaders in managing their teams and really to make culture and people development front and center of their agenda. So joining Uncommon was really the perfect marriage for me, bringing together my community building expertise and just passion for people development. And as head of learning, I design our members' experiences across group coaching, networking, learning opportunities, and I get to work just with inspiring experts and coaches, such as Elizabeth that we have today with us. I'm excited to introduce our guest speaker, Elizabeth Saunders, who's an author, time management coach, and founder of Real Life E, a time management coaching company that empowers individuals who feel guilty and overwhelmed to feel confident and accomplished about their time. Hi, Elizabeth. Thank you so much for being here today.
My pleasure.
I'd love to invite you to share a few more words, if you like, about yourself that you'd like our audience to know.
Absolutely. So I am a time management coach, and I've been doing that since 2009 and work with individuals all over the world. So I've had clients on every continent except Antarctica. No penguins or researchers have needed my help yet. And my passion and how I really began this business was out of the fact that in my first business, which I began in 2005, I had actually no boundaries between work and life. And so I had begun that business as an entrepreneur, and I'll share a few anecdotes throughout our time together, had no boundaries, felt guilty whenever I wasn't working, and then decided something needed to change. And through that change, developed a better way of living my own life, which then actually led to me starting the business, which I've now done for 14 years of time management coaching. So this is very much from a place of authenticity, and I do live out everything I'm going to be talking to you about today. So if you're in a place where you feel guilty whenever you're not working, I understand. I was there. And I'm happy to let you know for both myself and others, it is possible to overcome that.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And I can't wait to hear some of those experiences of your own. But before we get started, just a bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions for Elizabeth, or if there's something that really resonates with you, feel free to type it into the Q&A box, and we'll get to your questions during our Q&A session at the end of the webinar. And if you're excited to be here, you made time for it, and want to spread the word, feel free to just take a picture or take a screenshot and tag us on social media. We're at Hey Uncommon on Instagram, and this is Uncommon on LinkedIn. So let's dive in. We're going to start with a little poll, actually, and I'd like to invite all attendees to just answer this question. Choose, how good are you at setting boundaries? Okay, let's see the results we have here. Okay, so most a bit in the middle and on either end. So I hope that's why you're here today, and we'll definitely we'll dive straight into getting more tips on how to set some of those boundaries. Similar, to like exercise, meditation, or budgeting, most of us know that having boundaries around our work and professional lives is something we should do. Yet finding the time to change these behaviors, learn and build new habits is often easier said than done. I mean, for myself, I think growing up in Asia, I was raised in a culture where being respectful of your elders was really of utmost importance. I was taught to put others first and to say yes, to not really speak up or be too loud, and really to put my head down and do work. So this idea of saying no, of express is revolutionary. And I think it was also through my own experience, and where I reached a time in my career where I really couldn't do it all. Saying yes and trying to do everything was really having an impact on my health, on my relationships, and just in general, my joy of life. So the thing is with boundaries, I think is, I feel they're often invisible and intangible, even more so sometimes unknown even to yourself until they've sort of been crossed. And you find yourself being angry with the situation, with yourself. So I'd love for us to really unpack that on what it is we call boundaries, what it means, and really how it's showing up in the workplace today and how it can affect our own mental state. So Elizabeth, I'd love to start with some definitions. How would you define boundaries?
Yeah, great question. And I love what you just said about how oftentimes we don't know what they are till they've been crossed. And that is such a good point, because I think one really important thing to start out with is boundaries can look different for everyone. So the boundary that I might need to be okay and to feel happy and healthy might not be one that you need, or vice versa. And so I think number one, just as we're defining this, I want to say it is okay for the practical application to look different for you based on your personality, your life circumstance, your particular job. But in general, boundaries are what you are or are not okay with in terms of how you are treated or not treated, or what you are asked to do or not do. So for example, to make this tangible, a boundary, for example, for me, even with doing this webinar, was I could do this by 7 a.m. Eastern, my time, but I couldn't do this at 5 a.m. my time. And maybe for some of you, doing things at 5 a.m. is completely and totally fine. But for me, that wasn't going to work in terms of my brain being fully functional. And so that is an example of just a very practical, tangible boundary in terms of hours. And that was a huge part in my transformation to having a more balanced life. Another kind of boundary we can have is just in terms of what we are or are not willing to do in certain situations. So there's the tangible, like these are my hours or how I respond. But for example, maybe you're so happy to work on a report or turn things around quickly or that sort of thing, but only if you get that information during somewhat normal business hours, or at least before the time you would go to bed. But if someone gives you something at 10 p.m. at night, you're not going to have it ready for them by 5 a.m. the next day. Like, you'll have that ready maybe by 10 a.m. the next day, or whatever that is. So it's basically how far you're willing to go to accommodate what someone is willing to do, as well as the parameters around when you are not available. And so those boundaries are saying, this is who I am, this is what I need, this is how I respect myself, and just asking, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, that others respect what you need to be healthy, happy, and functional within the workplace.
Thank you for that. It's very thorough definition, and you put in a few. I loved how you went with sort of the tangible, and I know you do a lot of work around time management as well. And how do these two relate, would you say, in terms of time management and boundaries?
Oh, yeah, 100%. So if you have unrealistic expectations and you lack boundaries, it is impossible to manage your time well, or as I like to call it, invest your time well. So, for example, one of the big issues that we often face when a client starts working with me, and particularly if they're in the corporate world, is that their entire schedule is filled up with meetings and email. So it's all responding to what other people want or need. And so if you're going to change that, by definition, you need to have boundaries. You need to block time in your schedule when you're going to do focused work, have time to get your own work done, um, or even have time to answer email. Some people are in such back-to-back meetings, they don't even have time to respond to email during the day. And so that's all getting done after dinner or in the wee hours of the morning or late at night. And then there's really no time for project work. So it's impossible to invest your time to maximum effectiveness without having boundaries around when you do or don't meet with people, when you do or don't communicate, and what you need to be able to get your own work done. And that does apply whether you're in the corporate world or an entrepreneur, but it's particularly difficult if you're in a very meeting heavy culture.
Hmm. And why do you think it's important, I guess, for us to set boundaries? And, why have you devoted what you do? Because you could say, and I meet people all the time, who just entrepreneurs, especially, or leaders, a lot of leaders in Uncommon that are just, it's part of their job, right? They have to be available, or the business has to keep going. So why is this important for us?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, it's not sustainable. So, so if you, some part of you is lying to yourself if you think that you really can work 24/7 perpetually for decades and not burn out. Like you will burn out. So sure, you can do it for a while and it might work for a while, but at a certain point, it's not going to work. And you're either going to quit your job or start performing on a much lower level, or just kind of hate your life or get sick or something else. So, like, you could say, well, this is just part of the job or this is just how business is. But the truth is, it's not. Like, it's not how people are made, and it's not going to work for you long term. And ironically, when you think, oh, the harder I work, the better things will go, usually it's the exact opposite, because when you're not stepping back, you're not setting boundaries, you're being reactive instead of proactive, you're often working on things that are much lower value, and the really highest value, highest leverage activities that you could be doing are not getting done. So if you're not being honest with yourself that this is really sustainable, and you're also not really being honest with yourself that you have the highest level of effectiveness if you just think that you're going to do it with absolutely no boundaries. So that's why it's essential. And then in terms of, in particular, with either being an entrepreneur or working in the corporate world, I'll address the entrepreneur side first, because that's actually was part of my journey to where I am today. So my first business, which I started in 2005 when I was quite young, not far out of college, young 20s, I fell into it. I wasn't expecting to be an entrepreneur. And so I didn't come into it with a real intentional plan in terms of boundaries. And I was doing writing, editing, and photo styling for magazines and marketing material, and also contracting with companies with their marketing departments. And I was so grateful to have work, and I was so grateful that I could support myself and got to do this work I loved. And so at first it really didn't cross my mind to set boundaries. It was just like, oh wow, I have work and I want to do it, and people want to work with me. This is great. And so what that happened was, it basically led to a mush of everything. So I never really knew when I was working, but I never really knew when I wasn't working. And so I'd come home from a networking event and it'd be 10 o'clock at night, and I'd think I should answer business email, or be any time on a Saturday or Sunday, and I thought I should be working. And, I just came to a place where it didn't take me long, I guess a couple years, where it's like, enough is enough. Anytime I'm not working, like sleeping or eating, I feel guilty. I just don't feel successful. Like this just doesn't work for me. And at that point in time, and this was back in 2007, there was not really as much an emphasis on like lifestyle entrepreneurship or work-life balance. So I would go to entrepreneurial conferences and hear panelists speak about how, well, you just have to suffer. It just has to be horrible. And I'm like this like 20 something. I'm like, but I don't want to. And so I did learn how to set boundaries, how not to work at night and on the weekend. And I'm happy to report I'm still a full-time entrepreneur all these years later, and nothing terrible happened. And in fact, much better things happened. So if you have the mindset as an entrepreneur that the business can't work without you, or like you can't even sleep, you really need to work not only on your boundaries, but also your business model, because something kind of isn't working there. So I'd really caution you to believe that narrative. And then if you're in the corporate world, so there are some nuances involved, and I know it depends on your position. But what I will say is some boundaries in some way are necessary. So yes, maybe you will check your email some on the weekends, or be in touch some in the evenings, or have some travel you need to do. But for you, where you're at, and even if you're a consultant who flies out every week, at a certain point, you need to decide, I at least need to sleep, I at least need to exercise, I at least need this much time with my family or friends. And that doesn't mean you're never going to flex it, but you will burn out and you will end up having to, have health issues, or quit your job if you don't set some boundaries. So, and I have seen very high level executives set boundaries successfully. So it is possible, but it might just be a little more nuanced.
Thank you for sharing that and sharing your personal story as well. And in both those cases, you brought up the topics of burnout and also just health, right? And how would you say it's accurate to say that boundaries are an act of self-advocacy or self-care?
Yeah, 100%. Because other people cannot know what we need if we don't tell them. Like, they don't know that you maybe need to go to bed by 10 p.m., or they don't know that you haven't worked out today, or any of that. And they don't necessarily even need to know what you're doing. But if you don't set the boundaries to take care of yourself, it's not other people's responsibility or fault that that's not happening. And so it 100% is a self-efficacy in terms of determining what does or doesn't happen with your life. And then it also keeps you from just the emotional weight of burnout, because I write frequently for Harvard Business Review, and one of the articles I wrote for them was out about the causes of burnout and what the research said on that. And a lot of it isn't even how many hours you're working, but it's emotionally how you feel about it. Like, do you feel like you have the time for what's important to you? Do you feel like you're valued? Do you feel like you're properly compensated? So if you're consistently giving more than you feel is reasonable, and also if in whatever way, whether it's financially or recognition or otherwise, you don't feel you're being appreciated or compensated at the level that's appropriate for how much you're sacrificing, those are actually huge parts of burning out. And so when you're setting those boundaries, so you're not giving more than you can give without resentment, then you're much less likely to burn out.
And that's something that came up for us on a previous webinar we did on burnout. And this, this discussion around how feeling resentful at work is often a sign of a boundary that's been crossed or uncommunicated in many cases.
Right.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and I think, seeing some of those, picking up, I guess, on those signs, right, of where we failed, or as personally failed to communicate your limits, or what are those boundaries. And so what do you think what do healthy boundaries look like?
Right. So in terms of healthy boundaries, first of all, it's self-knowledge and self-awareness. So I would start out for anyone on this call who feels that they might need to work on boundaries or communicate them more. First of all, you need to know what you want and need. So maybe it's that between 10 p.m. and 6 or 7 a.m., you're not doing any calls, or you're not answering communication. It could be even bigger windows than that. Like I usually log off around 5:30 or 6 p.m. and then I don't usually log back on again until 8:45 or 9 in the morning. So I'm not saying you have to be on your computer all evening, but depending on your situation, like whatever that is, like decide, when I'm on, when I'm off, also boundaries around weekends. So I don't answer email on weekends. So that just doesn't happen. And that's just, it is how it is. So you want that self-knowledge around when you are or are not okay with communicating, also around like what methods of communication work best for you. So in general, like I don't do professional communication through my phone in general, like text. In general, that's all going to be through email, so I won't see it until the next working day. And then also you need to understand your boundaries in terms of what you can or cannot do within the context of work and how to balance that all out. And that's just not about self-awareness, because it's not as only about what you personally prefer, don't prefer, but also awareness of what you've committed to, what you need to get done, and what your priorities are. And that comes through you doing intentional planning. So, for example, I have all my clients work on daily and weekly planning. And if you've done those exercises, and in particular, if you've also tied them into like monthly planning or quarterly planning with your goals, then when you start your week, you should have a pretty good sense of what your top priorities are. So maybe key projects that need to get done, initiatives, things you need to prep for, maybe a conference you're going to, or a big presentation, or all of that. And so what that will look like is that over the course of the week, you know what your big goals are, your big priorities, and you have a rough sense of when they'll fit into your schedule, like Tuesday afternoon or Thursday morning or that sort of thing. So then when things come up throughout the week, it doesn't mean that we never respond to things that come up throughout the week or anything like that. But let's say you have everything mapped out for the week, you're aware of what you need to get done, and then your boss is like, well, what about this whole new initiative that doesn't relate to any of the goals that we set to the quarter, and how we do it right now. And so then you can have that discussion with them to say, wow, this initiative sounds so amazing. I can see why you're so excited about it. Right now, what I had on deck for this week was working on a presentation for this conference, and then these two other major projects tied to our quarterly goals. Do you see this initiative as being more important than these? Do you want me to shift my focus and maybe delay some of these other priorities that we were focusing on? Or is it okay if I focus on these goals and prepping for this conference, and then we circle back to this maybe next week or next month? And so that's the knowledge of what have I committed to, what are my priorities, what are my goals, so you can have those discussions. And so that's how we do that. It's self-knowledge, and then also awareness of your current commitments, your current priorities, so that you can foster those kind of discussions, which don't necessarily need to be all the time, oh no, I'm just not doing it. But given this context, given the situation, how can we make the best choices for the organization? So yeah.
Thank you for sharing those really concrete examples. And I'd actually like to pick up on a question that's been asked in the chat, because I think it's related to what we're talking about. And Sandy's asked, do you think there's any cultural differences or challenges to tell other parties on individuals' boundaries? And how do you take these differences diplomatically? I think you shared a little bit of that just now in that.
Right, for sure.
Differences side of things.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So absolutely, there are cultural differences. And I'm an American. I was born and raised American. And so I know I'm coming at it from that perspective. And I do know Asian culture can be very different. So I don't expect that everyone's going to have this like the same mindset or attitude or kind of like ethos always that I have, or way of communicating. And to be clear, there's not a right or wrong way to do things. So it's not that American culture is right and Asian culture is wrong or anything like that. So I'm not saying that. What I am saying high level is that no matter what your culture is, like we're all human. I work with people on every continent except Antarctica. every single continent, if you don't set boundaries at some point, you will burn out. So it's not like, oh, it just doesn't apply. And if you're Asian, like, you can work 24/7 and nothing bad will ever happen to you, and you're gonna be peak productivity. So the concept is the same, but just maybe how you communicate might be different culturally. So, and I think this is actually a very important point to be aware of, depending on, especially if you have cross-cultural communication. So example for the United States and my understanding in Western Europe, we tend to be much more direct. You don't always have to be direct, but we can tend to be more direct. So if you are working with a company where your boss or supervisor or manager is American, it will probably be okay for you to have more direct communication, or at least broach the subject. Like I was saying, like, okay, I can understand why you're really excited about this priority. I've got these other things on my plate. What do you think is most important? Like, you're not saying, no, I'm not doing that. Don't you understand? Like, my week is so busy already. Like, that's not going to go over well in any culture. But you're just saying, hey, like, this is what's going on. And I can say, if you're communicating with someone in my culture, it's going to be best for you to be direct and for them to know what you are or are not doing. I'm not an expert in Asian culture, but from my reading and understanding of that, you can sometimes be more subtle. So your boss might say, like, oh, I'm so excited about this project, and in a very subtle way, like maybe just saying, oh yeah, or something like that. They might understand you're not actually going to work on it this week, and it's not actually going to go anywhere because you have 10 other things to do. Um, Subtlety will not happen, like will not be understood in American culture. And so you're going to do better being direct, versus in Asian culture, maybe in a more subtle way, you can just acknowledge that you heard them and affirm them, but you're not actually going to do anything about it right now because you're completely booked, and you'll circle back to that later, or maybe not do it at all, and maybe that's going to be fine. And so you in Asian culture, you might need to be more subtle, but you still are going to need to set boundaries. You're not going to be able to do everything. If you're communicating with someone in Western culture, if you do not directly say, I'm not doing it, they will probably assume you are. And so you need to be a lot more careful that you're clear, but you do not have to be rude in any culture about it. So for example, another way to be kind but set boundaries was, this actually happened this weekend. I usually communicate with my clients through email, so that is the typical channel. I have a new client though, and she, for whatever reason, decided to text me this weekend, and which is fine. I wasn't like, why did you text me? She texted me, and she had one very quick question she mentioned, and I responded back, and then she texted me again and was like, oh, what planners do you recommend? And this was like Saturday in the middle of the day. And I didn't say to her, like, why did you text me, or it's Saturday, or like, how could you ask me a question? I just texted back and I said, I would be so happy to send you information on that on Monday. I'll get back to you then. And that's what it was. And I made a note on my calendar for Monday, and I'll email her today with information on planners that she can use. And so I think no matter what culture you're in, you can gently redirect people towards what you will do or what you can do, instead of necessarily telling them no, or like, why did you do that? Or don't you understand it's Saturday afternoon? So those are ways where in any culture we can do that. But one thing I would say, I understand in Asian culture, you probably will need to be more subtle in some cases, and that will also be understood. But I can also tell you that it will not go over well if you have a boss in a different kind of culture, because they will typically assume, unless you tell them no or specifically negotiate a different agreement, they will assume that you are doing something, and will be more upset if you didn't do it than if you told them you weren't going to do it.
Yeah, no, thank you. And that's great reply that you gave your client. And I think, I think similarly, well, I think in Asian cultures, like you mentioned, I think setting that precedent anywhere, right, is so important, right? And especially whether it's people that are reporting to you or also vice versa, right? And I think leading by example as well, right? In terms of, I think one thing with Asian culture is just that, letting people know that it's okay to have boundaries, to have, to set those boundaries, to talk about it, and to normalize it in a way, if that's the culture that you want to build as a leader. Great. Well, I think we're going to do a little mid-webinar poll as we start talking a lot about sort of in the workplace, right? And kind of identifying, having to balance those relationships. And we can call it people pleasing, or just feeling like you need to say yes, or you need to do something to show that you're working hard, or to build that relationship with someone in your organization. So I'd like to put this out. How many of you identify as people pleasers? Here we go. And yeah, we are talking here a bit more in the work context and professional context. So, okay, bit of a balance here, which is good to see. And I think, because yeah, I think this makes us think, back to some of the times when you haven't said no, right? Whether verbally or through actions. Were you being nice, or were you actually scared to voice what you needed? Being kind, or were you actually trying to suppress your own needs and emotions out of fear of coming across poorly to your superior or anyone else on the team? And so setting boundaries, we feel, is really critical, because people pleasing often involves denying our own needs in a lot of cases. So something I learned recently was actually that people pleasing is a survival strategy. Psychologists explain that people pleasers learn early on that their value derives from meeting other people's needs and from being helpful and overly accommodating. People pleasing tendencies are social constructs that we find women are especially subjected to. I think it's common in a lot of people, regardless of gender, but there are statistics that really reveal that it does affect women more than men. Among other reasons, for one, women tend to be judged and maybe punished more harshly for saying no, for instance, or feel like they would be. Elizabeth, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. How does people pleasing get in the way of us setting our boundaries?
For sure. So definitely in my work, I work with some people that are people pleasers, not everyone, but some for sure. And what can happen, it's not even necessarily a problem to want to make people happy or to help people. So I just want to make sure that there's not unnecessary shame around wanting to make people happy or wanting to serve people. Like, that's not wrong, that's not bad, and you're not a terrible person if you feel that way or want to do that. So some accommodation of others, meeting other people's expectations is not a problem at all. The problems arise when we do it to such an extent that it causes us to violate our own boundaries and sacrifice things that just are against our values or just are very unsustainable. And so I think that's really where we need to draw the line and distinguish and recognize that there are some times when you will not be able to make someone happy or do exactly what they want. And just because they're not happy doesn't mean you did anything wrong at all. And one other little note I wanted to make in this as I was preparing for our time together today is that sometimes it's people pleasing, which I would say I don't super identify with people pleasing. But what I would say I do identify that was my struggle, especially in the beginning of my entrepreneurial journey, was over responsibility. And so, what that looks like and how it's slightly different is when I was younger, I took responsibility for everything working out. So, a very concrete example of a way I used to do this and then how I learned to set boundaries was when I was working in my uh, business where I did writing. One of my contracts was with a company where I would write articles based on executive interviews. So these executives knew I was contacting them or other people were, and we had a certain deadline, so I wasn't being a spammer or anything. um, but we had deadlines and they needed to get done each month. And when I was in a place of taking over responsibility, I would feel like, oh, I've got to get this article done. I have to get it done by the deadline. And so I would call, email these executives and follow up call them if they didn't get back to me. And even if it ended up being completely last minute, like they didn't give me time for an interview until 3 or 4 o'clock, the day before it was due or the day it was due, I felt like, oh, I need to stay up till 1 a.m. to meet this deadline because this is the deadline and this is what we're supposed to do. And so I would really sacrifice myself for the sake of like, I have to meet this deadline. This has to be okay. And when I learned to have better boundaries around that and not take over responsibility, I did my part. I reached out to them right away. I did a follow-up email a few days later. I called if I needed to. I documented everything. But when it started to get close to the deadline, I would just make things clear. So my follow-up email might sound like, our deadline is by Friday. Um, if you're able to do the interview by Wednesday, we'll be able to meet that deadline. If you're not able to do the interview by Wednesday, then I'll need to let the editor know that this will be turned in later than that deadline. And then I communicated the same thing to my editor. I contacted this person, these particular dates and times. I've gotten no response. So I just want to make you aware that we're going to need an extension on the deadline. And so by just learning to not take over responsibility that other people not doing what they were supposed to do meant that I needed to kill myself, it really shifted things. So some of you might relate to people pleaser. For me, it was over responsibility. Either one, we need to learn better ways to set boundaries to be sustainable.
And I like that distinction you've made as well between, responsibility. And I think it's because I feel sometimes that, and maybe speaking sometimes in the Asian context, is people pleasing sometimes can come not necessarily from a truly authentic place, right? You're doing it for whether it's to save face, as they kind of call it in Singapore, or kind of show that, this is the role that you should be doing. But it's when you start working on that, it's not necessarily something, you're not working on the root of the issue, like you pointed out, in terms of changing how you can start saying no to things. And so I think, in speaking to some of our members, there is this fear of saying no, to taking on a new project or task, because of that backlash. Or if you're joining and your company, you're new in the role, you need to kind of say yes and accept everything that's being given your way, or you won't be seen as a team player. So how can we say no without jeopardizing our professional relationships and still kind of balancing, I guess, this need to take on the responsibility, but also to set our boundaries?
Right. Yeah. And so I understand that. Also, again, this can be very individualized. So if you're a consultant and you're getting flown to work somewhere Monday through Thursday, it's not like at 5:30 p.m. or 6 o'clock, you're just going to be like, okay, I'm not checking email or answering any messages. Bye, everyone. So I don't want everyone to think, oh, every context is going to look exactly the same. And also it can feel vulnerable when you're new to a role. You don't really even know how long things things will take you or what's going on or what's happening, and you don't want to come across as not caring or not contributing or any of that. So what I would say in terms of how to set boundaries or how to say no and to have hopefully less backlash or none at all is, first of all, again, coming back to having a really solid awareness to the best of your ability of what is or is not possible. Um, so what that's going to look like is, if your organization has quarterly goals, like getting really clear on what those are, and then what do they look like broken down to monthly goals. And then when you do weekly planning, what that looks like is you're going to look at your calendar and see what space you have in between meetings, if any, and then decide what your key priorities are for the week, what you're going to move forward during those times, and what that's going to look like. And that'll give you a sense of kind of what your time budget is like and how much you can actually get done. That may require you to start blocking times in your schedule, like I talked about before. That's a boundary where you can just have it as a recurring time when you're just not available. So you don't even necessarily need to communicate to people, I can't meet at that time. It's just already blocked and not free. And I would say one of the biggest things, particularly if you're new, is going to be communication about what's going on or not going on, and how you're doing with it. I don't recommend just going in and saying, oh, I'm overwhelmed and I can't do this, or no, but just saying, okay, my understanding are these are the key initiatives and key priorities you want me to be focused on. I think that these two or three, like, I can move forward this week, or I think these are the most important things for the month. So this is what I'm moving forward and doing. Like, are you okay with that? Is this accurate? And then I'm thinking that these other priorities seem to be a better fit for next month. Is that okay? And so not so much, again, saying what you're not going to do, but saying what you are doing and the choices you're making, and asking if they're aligned. And then if they just say, well, everything is a priority, you have to do it all. Which sometimes people do. Unfortunately, it's not a great management style, but it does happen. You're just going to need to triage and do the best you can. And at times that's going to mean that you slowly move forward some things, like maybe just schedule a few meetings about them, or do a little bit of research and do some reporting back about what's going on. But it's not going to be physically possible for you to quickly move forward many initiatives all at once without any boundaries. And so I think a lot of it comes across, like, if you have the attitude of, I am trying, I am being proactive, I am thinking about it, I want to do everything I can, how can I serve you best? How can this work? There's less likelihood for backlash. And then in the end, you are going to hit a limit. So if they won't give you any sense of priorities, you're going to do the best you can and hope it all works out. So it can be challenging, but it can be done. And I think a lot of it, if your attitude is one that's respectful and also humble, but confident, like that you know what you're doing and that you're clear, you're going to be a lot more successful than if you just don't stop to think about anything, take everything they say at face value, and then try to do it all, even though it's physically impossible.
Yeah, and I feel there is throughout our careers and time at work, whether it's a project or how a business is developing, you have to sort of, there's always a bit of a reassessment of your boundaries in a way.
Yep.
And I think you can set for yourself personal boundaries, like not answering emails during the weekend, or that you want to stick to. And then there's those sort of weekly boundaries. And I think there's sort of this push-pull constantly with work of how much is work, how much can you let it push your boundaries? You know, the one you have set for yourself, where do you have to be? Where do you maybe sometimes have to sacrifice as well certain things? But being fully aware of how that feels for you, making those sacrifices.
Sure. Well, another thing I would say is this doesn't mean that you're never going to have a time when you might be crazy busy. So there might be like a particular project or a particular conference or particular opportunity where, yeah, maybe you're going to work almost 24/7 for a few weeks to make things work out. So I'm not saying everything has to be rigid all the time. You can never flex. I don't think that's realistic, but it's just, if you always are treating everything like an emergency and you're never having any boundaries, you really don't even have the capacity to up level when something's a true emergency or true major opportunity. And it could be boundaries, but it could also be a delegation issue where maybe you need to delegate more or use your team more, and you could work a lot less and still get just as much done.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Thanks so much, Elizabeth, and some really, useful and concrete examples that you've shared. I want us to at least kind of wrap up our conversation before we open up for Q&A later. And we love ending our conversations with some actionable takeaways. And I think you shared so many throughout this conversation. So thank you for that. But I think, like you've said, throughout this, it's worth framing that there is no one size fits all solution. And while many of these tips are universal, we want to acknowledge that, the cultural nuances, the way you communicate, set, and receive boundaries is really depending on the culture you're in, the company culture that's there, the power balance, and sort of the type of role that you're in as well. But I'd love for us to kind of share, I guess, some tips that, we each have. I think for me, and something you mentioned early on in our conversation, and I've been reading Atomic Habits, actually, by and I feel there's such a correlation, between boundaries and habit forming. And because setting boundaries can be quite nerve-wracking at first. You want to say, okay, I'm not going to answer emails from 7 p.m. But actually putting that phone away or turning those notifications off can be nerve-wracking at first, sort of saying that first no. But I do think it is about sort of the baby steps, and putting in the habits you desire where they can really be seen, and starting to form those little habits bit by bit. I think for me also is the good old calendar. I think especially if you have a remote team or you want to create an open and transparent culture, for me, making my calendar visible to the team or to the desired people in the organization and being open about the time I need for quiet work, right? Or the time that's dedicated to calls, or even the time that you need to go pick up your kid from school. If that is the right culture, like we've said, that we're in, and just really starting to normalize the culture that you want to create in the workplace. What about you, Elizabeth? What are sort of some tips that you could give out?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, number one, just like you said, block your calendar. So if there's certain times you don't want to be available for meetings, whether it's because it's before or after hours, just make yourself unavailable so no one can automatically add something to your schedule without you knowing. And then if you choose to make an exception based on time zones or something else, you can, but there's no just someone grabbing time you're not okay with. Also, of course, block your calendar for some kind of focus time. So for example, in my work, I usually start work around 8:45 or 9, but I don't do coaching calls until 10. And so that gives me an hour, a little more to plan my day, to answer email, to get some small tasks done and get my own feet under me before I'm getting into the rest of the day, which really helps. And then also, and I know this may or may not work in every context, and it was something I was a little nervous about, but now I love, on Wednesdays, I don't do coaching calls. So I have that as a project day. So every Wednesday is blocked in my calendar. And that's when I do finances, I write articles, I write newsletters, I work on business development activities. So that just really helps me to be in a place to get done what I need to get done and then be available for calls the rest of the week. And then I would also say really be careful about your communication channels and your interaction with technology. So if you would really prefer people to email you instead of text or WhatsApp message or anything else like that, try to direct people in that direction. One way you can do that is even if they text you, perhaps respond via email. So keep keep kind of diverting them back to the channel that you prefer to have. And I personally do not use a smartwatch. I know for some people, maybe that's necessary or they want it or for whatever reasons those are. But if you can make it so you don't see any notifications outside of the hours when you want to see them or want to be engaged, that can be really helpful too. So it's out of sight, out of mind, and you're setting a boundary without even having to say anything. You just communicate when you get back to the office.
Yeah, thank you for those. I find that, yeah, that technology one's so difficult, especially in such a WhatsApp culture right now, in terms of people just so quickly kind of just popping in that question. And it is hard to set that boundary and not just reply straight away.
Yeah,
And I guess, I mean, sorry, just a question that's kind of popped up.
yeah, for sure.
Is what if you kind of go back on your boundary, or you cross your own boundary?
Mhm.
How do you kind of retrack if you need to?
Right. Right. Well, I feel like I had a little bit of that actually this weekend with the client. So clients usually don't text me. This client did, and I did respond to her text, which the first one was very simple. Like it literally required me to say, sounds great. So, so I don't usually communicate with clients on weekends, but it was literally all I had to say is sounds great. And so it was fine. And so then when she texted me again and was asking me a more complex question that was going to require a nuanced response. And my family was in the town and I was in the middle of things. I was like, there's absolutely no way I'm responding to this right now. Then I just did the gentle redirection of, I'd be so happy to answer that question for you on Monday. I'll get back to you then. So it's okay for us to do that and to, if we have initiated or we did respond, then just gently let people know, hey, for whatever reason, I'm not available right now, and know what to expect. So that's what I would recommend. And one other just quick thing I wanted to say is that um, I think a big part of the having boundaries too is just having faith. Like I'm a person of faith, and um, I think, I'm a Christian, but people come from all different perspectives. And I think if you trust, things really will work out. The weight of the world is not on your shoulders. You're not responsible for everything. It's not like if you don't hold the world together, no one else can. No one else can ever get anything done without you. It just takes such a weight off of your shoulders. And so I think there's a lot of practical things that we can do, but then also just in terms of mindset, recognizing it's not like Atlas where the world is on your shoulders. Like you don't have to have everything in control of the time. You don't have to solve everyone's problems. Things will work out in most cases, as long as you're not a surgeon, there's no blood, no one's going to die. um, that it really helps you to approach things from a more calm level and trust that the people you're supposed to work with, the clients you're supposed to work with, will respect you and it'll be fine. And if someone really can't handle you setting any boundaries at all, maybe they're not the right client, or maybe they're not the right boss, and maybe it's time to uh, look for a new position. So
Well, this is
there you
actually
go.
relates to one of the questions that has come up in the chat, where someone has asked that they find establishing boundaries with individuals with narcissistic tendencies to be quite challenging.
Yeah, yeah.
Could be effective there.
Yeah. So, I mean, if someone truly has like a narcissistic personality disorder, or borderline personality disorder or anything like that, um, if at all possible, and I know this may or may not be possible, but if it is, I would find a new situation to be in. And I don't say that lightly. Having both personally and professionally interacted with people where there truly is a psychological condition, these are people that have a real tough time with any sort of empathy or proper understanding for respect for other people. And if at all possible, I would get a new job, or I would consider, if they're a client, um, finding a way to communicate that maybe someone else would serve them better. There's with people within the normal realm of psychology, you typically will be able to set boundaries and be okay. There are some people where that probably is not going to be possible, and it is better to get out of the situation than to keep trying to do something with something where they likely will not change and will likely be very angry at you for being a completely reasonable human being.
Mm. Yeah, thank you for that. I think that is the best way. And another question here, as a team lead or part of company management, how can I encourage my staff or colleagues to communicate their boundaries?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, one is just normalizing that it's okay for there to be boundaries. So, like for example, let's say you send someone an email at, I don't know, 9 p.m. at night for whatever reason, because you chose to, and that you're okay with that, and that's not outside your boundaries. And then your someone on your team doesn't respond until 8 or 9 a.m. the next morning, and maybe they start out and say, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't respond earlier. I was with my family," or something like that. It's okay for you to say, I was on my computer at 8 or 9 and I sent that, but I don't expect you to respond right when I do. It's completely fine. This was non-urgent. It's totally fine that you respond the next day. Another way that you can encourage that is, even if you decide to work late at night or on the weekends, you can do delayed send or scheduled send on emails so that they aren't getting them until normal business hours. So that can really help. And then another thing is, if you can just be really direct about what is or isn't an emergency or isn't important, that is so helpful. So if you can, like, let's say it's Friday afternoon and maybe something really, really is urgent and you really do need them to do it over the weekend. Don't say this all the time, but if it really is, like, you can say, like, I'm sorry to do this to you. Like, this just came in from the client. Um, I don't need this by Saturday, but I could have this by Monday morning or by Sunday night. That would be great. I'm so sorry to do this. Or if it's truly not that urgent, for you to just say, "Hey, I know I'm sending this to you on a Friday afternoon. I don't expect you to work on this all weekend. It is completely fine for you to start on this on Monday. I just need to have a draft for review by Tuesday. So like I am sending this to you now, but you do not need to get this done until next week." That can be really helpful to you, because especially if they're more junior, they don't know like how to distinguish what's is or isn't important. And when you can do that for them, it really can give them a lot more confidence with knowing when they have to push and when it's okay to wait, when it's completely fine.
Yeah, I love those tips. And I actually got an email recently that someone sent, at I don't know what time, like early morning, and actually
Yeah.
sent their email. I'm not expecting a response on this. I just work crazy hours because I had, and
Yeah.
it was great. It set the
Yeah.
tone from the beginning,
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, yeah, communication of our own boundaries is so important for others to kind of follow suit. Um,
Absolutely.
so that brings us to the end, and I actually feel there's so much more I wish I could ask, but thank you so much, Elizabeth, for all the tips, the real life anecdotes, and really, showing us how setting boundaries isn't too nerve-wracking and can be done in a very respectful way, both for yourself and the others around you. And thank you everyone for joining. I'm sorry if we weren't able to get to your question, but if there's anything you'd like to follow up with, feel free to get in touch with me. But thank you everyone for attending this webinar. We really hope you took something away from the discussion. And we will be emailing a recording of the webinar afterwards, and we'll share some of the tips that were covered. And just for everyone who is joining, I know we have a few members here, as well as maybe people that have just heard about Uncommon. We are here to really build a new type of network for female leaders. And this conversation is just a taster of the kinds of topic-led discussions we organize. If you want the opportunity to connect with our community of like-minded women leaders, we are welcoming our next cohort or intake this Saturday, actually, and there are a handful of spots still remaining. So if you do wish to be part of this intake, please be sure to click the link in the chat box. I believe there should be something there any second now, and we will be sending up a follow-up email. So thank you again. Thank you so much to everyone for joining this evening. Thank you to Elizabeth for joining this morning. And we hope you have a great start to your week.
Sounds good. It was my pleasure. Take care, everyone. Happy to be here.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.